It is just after midnight on June 12, 1999. In the darkness outside Pristina, the capital of Kosovo, a column of approximately 200 Russian soldiers in armored personnel carriers is moving fast. They have driven through the night from their base in Bosnia, a journey of several hundred kilometers, unauthorized, unannounced, and completely unexpected by NATO headquarters, which believed it had coordinated the Russian role in the peacekeeping operation that was just beginning. The Russians have told no one where they are going. They have communicated nothing to the NATO commanders who are, at this moment, moving their own forces into Kosovo following the end of the 78-day bombing campaign that has just concluded. Their destination is Pristina International Airport. They arrive first. By the time NATO forces reach the airport perimeter, the Russians are already inside. Armored vehicles positioned across the runways, soldiers deployed at the terminal, the Russian flag raised over a facility that NATO had expected to occupy and control as part of the peacekeeping mission. In Brussels, in the Supreme Allied Commander's headquarters, General Wesley Clark is on the telephone to the British general commanding NATO's ground forces in Kosovo. He has an order: block the runway, prevent any Russian reinforcement aircraft from landing, use armored vehicles if necessary. On the other end of the line, General Mike Jackson listens to the order. And then he says something that neither government will officially acknowledge for years. The Kosovo War ended officially on June 10, 1999. Yugoslavia agreed to withdraw its forces. NATO agreed to end its bombing campaign. The war, 78 days of NATO airstrikes against a European country, the first offensive military action in NATO's 50-year history, was over. What came next was supposed to be straightforward. The peacekeeping force would enter Kosovo. NATO would organize the operation. Russia would contribute troops under NATO coordination. The occupation would be orderly. The reconstruction would begin. Instead, within 48 hours of the ceasefire, NATO and Russia were in a military standoff at an airport. An American general was ordering a British general to take actions that the British general believed would start a war. And the most dangerous incident of the post-Cold War era was unfolding in a way that neither side had planned for. Both sides were improvising around, and both governments would spend years trying to pretend had never been quite as serious as it was. It was serious. It was very nearly catastrophic, and it was stopped by one man saying no. To understand what happened at Pristina Airport, you have to understand the political context that produced it. Russia in 1999 was a country in the middle of a prolonged and painful adjustment to a world it had not chosen. The Soviet Union was gone. The Warsaw Pact was gone. NATO had not only survived the Cold War but was expanding eastward, admitting former Warsaw Pact members and moving its borders closer to Russia's. The bombing campaign against Yugoslavia, a Slavic country with close historical ties to Russia, had been conducted without Russian consent and over Russian objections. For the Russian military and political establishment, Kosovo was not just a humanitarian intervention. It was a demonstration of what NATO expansion meant in practice: that the Western Alliance could conduct military operations in Europe without Russian participation, without Russian approval, and against Russian interests, and that there was nothing Russia could do about it. The surprise move on Pristina Airport was Russia's answer to that demonstration. It was planned at the highest levels of the Russian military, almost certainly with the knowledge of Boris Yeltsin's government. The column of vehicles that left the Russian base at Ugljevik in Bosnia on the night of June 11th was not a rogue operation. It was a calculated geopolitical move, designed to establish a Russian military presence in Kosovo before NATO could consolidate control. The Russian commander who led the column was a general named Viktor Zavarzin. His vehicles reached Pristina airport at approximately 3 a.m. on June 12, hours before NATO forces arrived. General Wesley Clark, the Supreme Allied Commander Europe, wanted the situation resolved immediately and on NATO's terms. He called Mike Jackson. Mike Jackson was, in June 1999, a three-star British general commanding the NATO implementation force in Kosovo. He was 55 years old, a veteran of Northern Ireland, the Falklands, Bosnia, and the Gulf War, with a reputation for both operational competence and a directness of manner that made him an occasionally uncomfortable figure in the careful world of military diplomacy. He was not a man who refused orders lightly. Clark's order was precise: deploy armored vehicles on the runway at Pristina Airport to physically prevent any Russian military transport aircraft from landing. The logic was straightforward from Clark's perspective. If Russia was allowed to fly in reinforcements, it would establish a separate sector of Kosovo under Russian control, potentially partitioning the territory and creating a permanent Russian military foothold. Jackson's calculation was different. He had troops at the airport perimeter. He could, technically, execute the order, but executing it meant deploying NATO armored vehicles in direct confrontation with Russian soldiers who were already on the ground, soldiers who also had orders, who also had weapons, and who would be placed in the position of either surrendering control of the airport or firing on NATO forces. And if a NATO force fired on Russian soldiers, or Russian soldiers fired on NATO forces, at an airport in Kosovo in June 1999, what happened next was not a question with a comfortable answer. Russia had nuclear weapons. Russia had a military establishment that had just watched NATO bomb a Slavic ally into submission and was in no mood to be humiliated again. The political consequences of a shooting incident between NATO and Russian forces were, in Jackson's assessment, incalculable. He told Clark he would not do it. The exchange that followed has been described differently by the various participants, but its essential character is not disputed. Clark insisted. Jackson refused. Clark reminded Jackson of the chain of command. Jackson acknowledged the chain of command and refused anyway. The phrase that Jackson used, "I'm not going to start World War III for you," has the quality of a line that sounds too perfect to be literally accurate, and Jackson himself has given varying accounts of whether he used those exact words or something functionally equivalent. What is not disputed is the substance. A British general, in direct conversation with the Supreme Allied Commander of NATO, refused a lawful military order on the grounds that executing it risked triggering a conflict whose consequences he was not prepared to accept responsibility for. Clark escalated. He called the British Chief of the Defence Staff in London. He sought authorization to relieve Jackson of command. He was told, in language that was diplomatic but unambiguous, that Britain supported Jackson's judgment. The standoff continued through the night. The resolution came not from either side backing down but from geography. Russia had planned to fly reinforcements into Pristina Airport. The flight paths from Russia to Kosovo ran through the airspace of Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria. all of them former Warsaw Pact members that had either already joined NATO or were in the process of doing so. Russia asked for overflight permission. Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria all said no. Without reinforcements, the approximately 200 Russian soldiers at Pristina airport were isolated, enough to make a political point, not enough to establish a sustainable, independent military sector. Within days, Russia agreed to integrate its forces into the NATO peacekeeping structure. The crisis was over. But its resolution was, in a precise sense, accidental. If Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria had granted overflight permission, the situation at Pristina airport would have been very different. Russian reinforcements on the ground would have created a military and political reality that NATO could not simply wait out. The pressure on Clark to act would have been enormous. And the question of what Jackson would have done, or been ordered to do, would have been asked in a context where the stakes were considerably higher. This counterfactual is not idle speculation. It was the calculation that Jackson had made in real time on the night of June 12th, when he refused Clark's order. He had assessed that the order was dangerous not just in itself, but in what it would invite, that blocking the runway would escalate rather than resolve the confrontation, and that escalation was a risk he was not prepared to accept. He was right, and the overflight denials meant that his refusal never had to be tested against a reinforced Russian position. Both governments handled the incident with the institutional discretion that governments apply to episodes they would prefer not to have analyzed too closely. Clark, in his memoirs, described the episode with considerable bitterness, suggesting that Jackson's refusal had been both insubordinate and strategically mistaken. Jackson, in his own memoir published in 2007, was somewhat more candid about what he had calculated and why. Clark's career effectively ended with Kosovo. He was asked to retire from NATO command early, and his subsequent political ambitions never gained significant traction. Jackson was promoted. He became chief of the General Staff in 2003. There is a question at the center of Mike Jackson's refusal that military ethicists and historians have been arguing about ever since the details became public. Was he right to refuse? Military command structures exist for a reason, because the coordination of complex operations under conditions of uncertainty and danger requires that orders be followed, that individuals subordinate their own judgment to the collective decision-making of the command hierarchy. An army in which every officer reserves the right to refuse orders they personally consider unwise is not an army. It is a discussion group. Clark's argument was that Jackson had substituted his own geopolitical judgment for that of his superior officer, that this substitution was institutionally dangerous regardless of whether the judgment was correct, and that the precedent set by a senior officer publicly refusing a direct order was more damaging to the alliance than whatever tactical disadvantage resulted from not blocking the runway. Jackson's argument was that there are orders whose potential consequences are so severe that the obligation to follow them is outweighed by the obligation to prevent catastrophe, that a soldier's duty is not simply to obey, but to serve, and that serving, in the circumstances of June 12, 1999, meant refusing an order that he believed risked triggering a conflict no one had authorized, no one had planned for, and no one was prepared to manage. Both arguments are serious. Neither is obviously wrong. What makes Jackson's refusal different from simple insubordination is the precision of his calculation. He did not refuse because he disagreed with Clark's strategic objectives. He refused because he assessed, with the specificity of a soldier who had spent his career thinking about exactly these kinds of operational decisions, that the order was wrong in a way that mattered more than his obligation to follow it. And he was willing to accept the professional consequences of that refusal, rather than execute an order he believed was catastrophically dangerous. The incident at Pristina Airport has never been fully declassified by either the British or American government. The conversations between Jackson and Clark exist in partial accounts, filtered through the self-interested memories of the participants and the institutional preferences of two governments that would rather the episode be remembered as a manageable disagreement than as the moment NATO almost fired on Russia. But the shape of what happened is not seriously disputed. 200 Russian soldiers seized an airport. An American general gave an order. A British general refused it. The overflight denials resolved the crisis before the refusal had to be tested against its worst-case implications. And somewhere in the distance between what happened and what might have happened, between the standoff that ended and the war that did not begin, there is the space that one man's judgment created. Not a large space, not a comfortable one, just enough.